Okay, so project 2, video 2. This is some basic to maybe more intermediate type tools, Illustrator. And first, we haven't talked about this yet, and if we have, this is a good time for a review. That's looking at the pen tool. One of the most basic things you can do with text is putting it on a path, making a path. This is the pen tool right here. Okay? Pen tool, it's a difficult tool to get to know. Some people have an easier time with it than others. Let's try and look at it really simply. It is points and paths that connect the points. The points are how you change direction. So if I click and then I click again, now I can change direction. And click again. Now if I want to make a curve, I have to click and drag. So I'm going to make another point, but I'm going to click and drag. Click and drag. So these are handles. I'm holding on to one handle, the other handle is on the other side. That's a curve. Now, anytime I make a curve through a point, a curve is going to come out of that point. So even if I make this a corner, you still have a curve going to it. Takes another point, really. Now it's a corner. Okay, let's switch these, right? And don't worry that follows you. Of course it does. So we have a path, and again, practice the click and drag. Do consecutive click and drags, and you get a big curve just like this. How do you stop this thing from following your pen tool? Well, it won't until you close a shape. So you can go back to your original anchor point, click on that, and your shape is closed. Now, any of these points, these anchor points, you can manipulate. You have to manipulate them. We have a general selection tool, which selects the whole object. A direct selection tool, which will select a specific point. So if I select this point, I can move it wherever I want to. See that? And in addition to that, I can also take the anchor point tool and convert this anchor point to a curve. Right? Isn't that fun? Okay. So one of the things that's important to remember is when you're drawing with the pen tool, you don't have to draw everything perfect as you're drawing it the first time. You can go back to these points and adjust where they are, and a lot of times that's how you do a good job of whatever it is that you're doing. It's not by making it perfect the first time, but going back to some lines, pushing where they are, adjusting, playing around with the curve. That's how you get things to do what you want. Don't try to get everything perfect the first time you're drawing something, okay? That's important. So, this is how we draw something. We can change any of these points that we want to. If you wanted to draw an object, and let's say we have this path now, this is a path, you could take your text tool and take that text tool right until you see that little arrow right over the path. And when you see the word very small, when you see the word path, you can click on that. Now this is basically type in a shape within a path, filling a shape. Okay, so that occurred. Why? Well, there's basically two ways you can go: an open path or a closed path. If you draw a closed path, that's a shape. And if you bring the type tool over and you see the word path, if you're right on the path, your type is going to fill that closed path if it's a closed path. If it's an open path, you'll have type on a path, on the line, because, again, there is no shape to fill. It's an open path. Now, let's look at an open path. I'm going to draw another line, try and make it complicated. Click and drag, click and drag, click and drag, and we click and drag. All right. And we will change that so it has no fill. So I'm going to pick right about here to start on the path. We have our character box open, 36 point, and we'll type out death of a salesman. Okay. Now, we don't have to worry too much about how perfect that path is or what it's doing. We can zoom in, and the important thing, almost, kinda, is that, let's select it again just so we can see where one of those points is. And view outline. There's one point right here. Okay. So I'm going to select this point right here, and we can move where that point is, and as we do, of course, we move the type. So you can select any one of those points. Now, if we go back to what we're looking at here, what that means is we can move this down, this maybe over here, this down here. Let's move this point down there. And we can kind of get this to conform to whatever kind of path you want. And that's really important to remember, that it's not really that critical how perfect your path is when you start off. It's really just much more important that you get the hang of the pen tool. If you haven't worked with it so much before, get used to manipulating the points and the curves. Okay? Also keep in mind that this path, you can add anchor points, delete anchor points. If you go to Object, Multiple Paths, you can join, you can group, move different paths that are related, that are on organic lines. You can group them, move them together. You can add anchor points, remove anchor points, all with the pen tool. Keep in mind also that type on a path has some options, specifically right here, that if you just go to type on a path options. Let's go back to just plain straightforward type. This is a text block. So this is kind of normally how we see things. There's a certain amount of distortion that you can just create just with your bounding box. Is basically everything in Illustrator is an object, a bounding box, whatever you want to call it. This reads to Illustrator essentially as a rectangle. What's inside of it is PostScript. So it's a whole different language. It's not what we call vectors. It's not paths and anchor points. You can do that. You can convert it to paths and anchor points, but it isn't right now. It's just PostScript. Basically the same thing it is in Photoshop. And just as in Photoshop, PostScript, this language, let's say, is completely different than vectors and completely different than pixels. So there's certain things that we can do while it's like this. For example, changing the size, right? Changing the font. And that's an awful font. And this is our leading. This is our tracking, leading being the space between lines, tracking being, this is tracking, this is kerning. Slightly different, the space between letters. So, in terms of what we can do with this, we definitely want to change the font here. You do have some effects, and as I think I mentioned before, under stylize, you can do a drop shadow, feather, basically what we have here, and most importantly, warp. Before we get into some of this stuff, let's go back here, and you can see right now the fill color is black, stroke color is white. If we switch those, you can see that. Let's go to our fill color and maybe make that like this, a tan color, light brown, okay? Now, let's try, as an example, going to Effect, Stylize, Drop Shadow. We can look at our drop shadow, opacity 75%. We could change some of that, but we'll leave it where it is. Okay, just so we can kind of see the difference. And again, keeping this in mind, let's change the font, and you can see that follows, stays there, whatever you change it to, So it's basically anything under stylize is kind of fully functional along with formatting. Now, when you get down here, Photoshop effects, no, because you will be rasterizing what's here, and you want to avoid that. Not only will you not be able to format it anymore, but it's not vectors either. So it becomes kind of a really heavy piece of luggage to carry around Illustrator. And again, you don't really want that. You have certain things that you can do here, distort, transform, you have to be very careful with, and Pathfinder also. So particularly important in our effects, especially when you're working on a radial design, might be under warp. Some of these presets, very easy to use. If we look at arc, just kind of a predictable arc, you should, with a preview, let's try and get the preview to work, there it goes. So the preview works sometimes and not others. But you can see how you can change that. And you can push it one way horizontally, more towards this direction or the other direction. And the same thing vertically. Whoa! But we want to be careful with that. But again, this could be really helpful in your radial design. And again, you can go through all of these. Something like inflate, you have to be pretty careful with type. You can see what that looks like. Vertically, we might want a little bit more stretch on that, but unfortunately, one of the things we can't do is combine these, because that would be pretty interesting, but not yet. Alright, so we'll cancel that. And again, there are a lot of things that you can do with stylize and color, and so on. A lot like layer styles in Photoshop, and the types still formattable. When you want to get into more heavy-duty manipulation of type, first you really want to consider whether you want this to be a serif or a sans serif. And at this point, maybe it's better to go with a simpler. I'm going to go with something that's simpler, also gives me more weight. In other words, it's fatter. And let's go to Object, Envelope, Distort. Okay? Object, Envelope, Distort is where you really get into other options, manipulating type. Let's go back to Envelope, Distort. And while this is selected, if you go to Envelope, Distort, Make with Warp, you can see basically this is just what we looked at under Effects. It's just listed in two different places. And again, we're really just working with the rectangle, the whole type block as a whole. There's only so much flexibility, okay? But here's the good thing, and let's zoom out a little bit. Just working with something like this, we can take a direct selection tool and we can alter this. So in other words, this can be a stepping off point. You can get into certain kinds of variation, right? Let's pull this up here, okay, to get this a little bit funky. Keep in mind here that all you're really working with, because we haven't created outlines, is, as I said, just that rectangle. The rectangle is really all you're manipulating. Now, you can do quite a bit manipulating the rectangle. We can also go back to Object, Envelope, Distort, Reset with Mesh. Okay, right now we have one row that's one across and 3 columns. You can increase the number of rows if you want. Let's hit preview and increase the number of columns. Okay, what does that do? Well, it just gives you more anchor points to possibly manipulate, more curves, and that'll have some effect, right? And you can see again, keep in mind that as you stretch that rectangle in a particular direction, the contents are stretched in a particular direction. You could actually do the same thing with a photo. I mean, it's manipulating the rectangle. The contents within it get manipulated as a result of that. Let's just, go a little bit further, manipulate this. You can see how that changes. We'll pull that down. But you get the idea. And the good thing about not going any further and creating outlines is that you maintain a certain amount of readability. The type stays very intact. It's a little bit tougher to make it unreadable. You can if you want. I mean, particularly if you start playing with, like, let's say, an inside curve. I'm going to click on this point, bend an inside curve, and now you can get some readability issues. Those curves are kind of interesting to play with, but that's where you might start losing readability. So going back to this idea of I'm just manipulating a rectangle, I mean, you really are. You're just giving it more points. If we look at object, envelope, distort, release, boom, there's your rectangle. That's really what it is. I mean, we can see the type underneath of it, but this is what we've been manipulating all this time. Getting into manipulating the letters directly, that's much different. So this is a way to go, though, because you can work with this and keep your letters pretty intact. Let's go back to envelope, distort, release. We'll just delete that, okay? And type it out again. Right? Okay. And again, let's think about whether you want a fill color. Remember that. I'm going to go with the same fill color. And in some cases, depending on what you're doing, you might, again, the weight of the font itself could be really important. So we can do certain things here in terms of size. We don't necessarily want to change the proportions. Let's go back to object, envelope, distort, and make with mesh. If we do that directly, if we do that first, that might give you, and I'm going to put in 8, so it gives me a lot of columns. that might give you a little bit of a better sense of how easy it might be to manipulate point by point. Now, another way of manipulating things, as opposed to point by point, anchor points, is kind of what I call a freehand warp. Okay, so finally got the warp tool to show up. If you don't see it, open your options down here for the tools. Go to the warp tool, right? Click on it, and while it's selected, hit Shift R. Again, let's try that again. Click on the warp tool, hit Shift R, and there it is. Okay? It's important to have it show up because you got to double click on it to see the options, brush size, warp options, detail, because there's a number of warps that you can use. Intensity, 50%. Let's just try that out at 70%. Okay? And this is kind of the default size. And so what the warp tool does, and again, because we're still working with a rectangle, even though we have all these anchor points, it's going to manipulate that. And as soon as I hold that, it's going to drag this down. So that's a lot of manipulation. Woo! And it can get very sloppy, you know. The rectangle itself holds the type block together, so there's some advantages to doing it with the still as type, you know. You can kind of manipulate this quite a bit, you know, get very 60s, very trippy here. But you know, you don't just kind of want to go crazy and make things unreadable just for the heck of it. You can take something like the top of the suitcase and kind of make it a lot more organic, though. You can make it a lot more lively, you know, a lot more of that groovy 60s feel just by using something like this. And you can still go in, remember, this rectangle, you can still go into that rectangle and manipulate what you have here. If you need to drag an area, you can just click on how these are divided into sections. You can click on a section and pull it down. Just like this. Let's pull this section down. Let's pull this section down. You know, and this and so on. So there's so much manipulation you can do while keeping this in a rectangle. One has to ask, do you really need to take it out of the rectangle? Look, we're getting all, you know, as soon as you start overlapping things, forget about it. But, you know, do we need to create outlines and get even more crazy? Yeah, usually not, you know. You can do pretty much anything you want to here. Again, let's go back, and you can see what that looks like without the box. Pretty crazy. So let's select everything, delete it, and I'm going to type it out again. And we'll do more caps. And we don't want that. So just stretch this out a little bit. Dearth. That would be another interesting play. Dearth of a salesman. Or dearth of salesmen in general. And from here, again, as text, object, envelope, distort. You can start with a mesh, and again, we started with warp, but you can certainly start with a mesh, manipulate that mesh a little bit, however you want to do it. Let's use the direct selection tool, select an individual point, right? And let's make this again. Maybe in this case, I want to do all caps because we're going to do some really far out stuff now. Okay, and I'm going to keep the letters simple, right? Maybe a little bit bigger. Let's go up to 60. That's about as big as you can get in this page. And 60 is a little bit too big. So I'll go down to like 55. Okay. So envelope distort just means basically there's an envelope that you're distorting things with, and so far, it's been a rectangle, an arc, or a mesh, but the envelope distort is important. And remember, you can do that with a photo, something that you drew in Illustrator, anything. So what does this make with top object mean? Good question. Make with top object means, okay, this is one object. Now what I'm going to do in this case is I am going to draw another object, and this will be the top object. When you're doing a top object for something like this, like a text block, it has to be pretty similar. It's almost like working with a mesh in that, you're starting maybe with something that is kind of a rectangle. It's got to match up somewhat. If you just took this and you created something totally different, curvilinear and all over the place, this would just go into it in a very unreadable way. I can't just do, something crazy like this and expect it to really work. If I try, let's try, I want to select both. That's the top object, right? These are so different. And go to object, envelope, distort, make with top object. Ooh, yeah. So, it does what it's supposed to do, but is it readable? No, not at all. And so you kind of get the idea of maybe what you're trying to do. by using that top object. So I'm going to take this. Now, if you can do something that's fairly similar, you could use the pencil tool to draw this if you use a lot of smoothing, if the smoothness is turned all the way up. I'm going to use the pen tool. Good practice for you to use the pen tool also. I'm going to try and keep it fairly simple, you know, a few curves here and there, but I don't want to make it too different, and I've got to have kind of something that resembles that box somewhat. So I'm going to keep this pretty curved, come back to here, right? Let's see how this works. And remember, when you draw your top object, it's just like anytime you use the pen tool, don't worry about being perfect. Don't worry about being perfect at all. So let's select that, select this, go to Object, Envelope, Distort, Make with Top Object. There you go. That's a little bit closer. So then you look at, well, what do I need to do? You might need to, you know, can you pull out this anchor point maybe a little bit, or pull out this end here to make that end a little bit more readable? Maybe. It's just stretching the whole thing. You might be able to pull one corner, see what happens to that D, but it's still very flexible, right? And of course, you know, you can take the pen tool and you can draw any kind of shape that you want, really. Let's see. I think that gives you a pretty good idea of what you can do with things as a block. Now, can you take this, right? Go to Object, Envelope, Distort, and Reset with Mesh. Let's make it 2 rows, 8 columns. Click OK. What does that do? Again, just like when you used a preset warp in the beginning, and then you add the mesh afterwards, it gives you more control. So it might enable you, let's say, to get a little bit more. Let's go into the individual points again. Got to use the direct selection tool. So it might enable me to get a little bit more of a view of that end, although that's proving difficult. But you can kind of imagine how you could manipulate this. And again, even though we're doing type here, this really applies to any object in Illustrator that you want to manipulate it, and it could contain a photograph, just like in this case, it contains type. And you can still change your mind and change this to an arc or something very general. Let's look at the other alternative. The other alternative from all of this, you know, and keep in mind, everything I just did with that title I could do with a paragraph. You know, if I wanted a paragraph to fit in a certain way, you can do anything that you want with that. If you can get the right effect that you want with something that's more of a preset or a simple transformation like skew or something like that, do that, because you really don't want to distort the type unless that's really what you're looking for. Like when you look at some of those late 60s posters, the type is distorted, it's on purpose, that's part of the look. But you want to kind of keep things readable, particularly for the radial composition. I wouldn't get into manipulating things in too specific of a way. Okay? And now we're going to look at, again, that last option, which is the most drastic. And that's kind of using everything as an object. So the first thing that we would do, I'm just going to distort this just to get them a little bit bigger, easier to see. I'm going to distort these vertically, all right? And typographers would hate me right now. But I'm going to make these more vertical. Then I'm going to go to type, create outlines. What create outlines does is it essentially makes every one of these into a vector object. So this is actually a vector object now. And you could click on one point and manipulate that one point. So it's that specific. Like I can change the D in that specific of a way. That's good and bad. I mean, if you have a purpose for it, that's good. But, you know, if you don't, that could be bad. Very bad. So, let's take, for example, you know, just a general warp. And I'm going to zoom out so we can see a little bit more. Oh, here's the other thing. So these are all grouped when they're converted to vector objects. They're all grouped together. If you want to ungroup them, you can go to Object Ungroup. Right now, they're grouped. And so if we took the warp tool directly to this, and even if we made it a bigger circle, this is going to get really ugly really quickly. You see that? And you know, compared to when you're working with a rectangle, there's something different that happens here. The letters as a block, each letter in a sense is in a rectangle. Even the S's, that rectangle gets distorted. And really it changes the typography kind of beyond all recognition very quickly. So that's maybe something we don't want to do, except in a really small area, maybe something that's very minor. It's hard to do otherwise. On the other hand, you could look at the options that you have here under Envelope Distort. The original presets are kind of the same for the most part. Those warps, right? If you make with a preset warp, and let's say it's an arc, okay? Look what happens though. you go back to working with a rectangle. Because of that preset, you lose the individual outlines. So that really is something to keep in mind, because in some ways you're really losing flexibility. And if you just want to do a simple arc, you can just keep it as formatable type. There's no reason to do this. If we go to Object, Envelope, Distort, Make with Mesh, and let's do, let's say 3 and 12 here, gives us a lot of points. So here, if we do the same thing, it's a little bit different. The mesh kind of maintains the original shapes a little bit more, so you can take that freehand warp tool. But again, you can see the difference between manipulating with outlines as opposed to formatable type. Look at how the S and the E changes, and you can go through the middle here and change them. There's a lot more that's possible. The type becomes a lot more flexible. You can basically, like, you know, if you want to, you can illustrate with it. You can make bubbles. You can do, you know, whatever you want to do with it, but there's a cost, because the type can easily become unreadable. And I'm going to zoom back out again. And, you know, looking at everything, for most uses, even dealing with organic, I would say your best move, and it's not that important unless you want to do really specific, detailed manipulation. It's not that important to create outlines and make these into vector objects. Depends on what you're doing. If you're dealing with one letter and you really want to manipulate it and kind of make it almost into an illustration, yeah, of course, you could make that into an object. But, you know, this is regular formatable type right now. And in most cases, I would say just go to Envelope, Distort, Make with Mesh, and 3 rows, 12 columns is a lot. It gives you a lot to work with. Here's the other thing. You can take the direct selection tool and just like draw a rectangle over the points that you want selected, and it'll just move that section. You know, you can do things in a pretty measured way. You can also get really crazy if you want to get really crazy, and you have curves to work with which really do change the nature of the letter. There's a lot that you can do with your standard warps, the preset warps. You know, you have those. Doing a preset warp like an arc, then doing a mesh and doing any additional manipulation you need to do. That works for radial, that probably works for organic for a lot of things. But the mesh is kind of key here. And individually, those points are key. So this should help in terms of anything that you could possibly want to do with type.